Let's jump right into this explainer where we're tackling the mind-money connection, healing your finances. Today, we're unpacking a really holistic toolkit that looks at two things we almost never put in the same sentence: your mental well-being and practical, simple financial management. We're going to figure out why we actually struggle with money, and more importantly, how to fix it from the inside out.
And we're starting off with this incredibly raw quote from writer Jodi Allard. She realized that her own lifetime of paralyzing debt actually stemmed from childhood trauma. For years, she just assumed she was fundamentally flawed, just bad with money. But eventually, she figured out that her financial instability was really a symptom of a much deeper psychological issue. She was avoiding her credit and shutting down emotionally because those were her ingrained coping mechanisms. It's a massive shift in perspective, right? Realizing that what we so often label as financial laziness is sometimes actually a trauma response.
So let's get right into section 1, the mind-money connection.
To really destigmatize our financial struggles, we've got to look at the biological and psychological realities of how we manage our wallets. Academic research points to this bidirectional, reinforcing loop of disadvantage. It basically works like this. Bad mental health, say a sudden depressive episode, impairs our cognitive functioning. That leads to missed bills or impulsive spending. And then, that resulting debt and income instability absolutely skyrockets our daily anxiety. One just feeds right into the other, creating this exhausting cycle that's super tough to break.
Which brings us to section 2, escaping the shame spiral.
When we're caught in that cycle, we hit a massive psychological roadblock. And we need to talk about the fundamental difference between money guilt and money shame. Guilt is external, and it's temporary. It's that voice saying, I made a mistake buying that expensive coffee when I shouldn't have. But shame? Shame is a heavy internal attack on your actual identity. It says, I am bad with money. That tiny shift in language triggers a totally destructive shame spiral where you're constantly looking for evidence to prove to yourself that you're a failure.
And the thing is, shame doesn't just survive on its own. It's actively fed by our environment. According to Brené Brown, a renowned shame researcher, shame thrives on 3 specific things: secrecy, silence, and judgment. Unfortunately, these 3 amplifiers are literally everywhere in traditional personal finance culture. I mean, think about it. We joke all the time about hiding Amazon boxes from our partners, but we are absolutely terrified to openly discuss our 401ks or credit card debt. We judge every little purchase, and that silence, that's exactly what keeps us trapped. So, how do we actually break out? We have 4 really powerful tools here. First up, naming. Just owning the mistake with total transparency to strip away its power. Second is empathy, which means giving yourself the exact same grace you'd offer a best friend in the same situation. Third, we need support, finding a safe community or even just one person who will listen without judging you. And fourth, education. It's about finding the actual lesson in the experience so you can change your behavior moving forward rather than just endlessly beating yourself up.
All right, moving on to section 3, calming your nervous system.
Look, before we even attempt to do any math or open a complex spreadsheet or track a single dollar, we absolutely must physically regulate our financial nervous system. And that brings us to this really beautiful exercise called neurographic art. Developed by a psychologist, this practice is basically about freely scribbling on paper to transform stress into something visual. When you're panicking about a bill, just letting your hand move a pen across a page without overthinking it, it actually shifts your brain from acute anxiety into the state of gentle, fluid movement.
But the real magic happens in step 2, rounding the intersections. When you go back over those chaotic scribbles and literally draw curves to round out the sharp, jagged edges where your lines cross, something amazing happens. You are physically training your brain to soften sharpness. That physical act of smoothing out harsh corners on the page translates directly to a cognitive release. It moves your whole body from tension to relaxation.
And this practice applies directly to how we handle our money. Just like rounding the harsh edges of a stressful drawing, we have got to soften our rigid, sharp self-judgments. We have to pause, take a breath, and respond with calm instead of panic. Honestly, only then do we actually have the mental clarity to sit down and tackle the numbers.
Let's hit section 4, why first budgets fail.
Now that we've let go of that financial guilt and calmed our nervous system down, let's talk about why most beginners stumble right out of the gate. When you first try to budget, you aren't failing because you lack discipline. You're failing because the system you're trying to use demands absolute perfection. You invent 20 hyper-optimistic categories for every tiny little expense, but completely ignore the reality of your actual cash flow. Getting your payday and your bill due dates to live on the exact same calendar, that is a total game changer. Timing is literally everything.
which leads perfectly into Section 5, Simple Systems That Work.
Let's ditch the complex, overwhelming spreadsheets for a minute and look at some actionable frameworks that actually feel liberating. The famous 50-30-20 rule is a fantastic starting point here. It suggests putting 50% of your income toward your absolute needs, 20% toward future savings, and 30% toward your wants. And honestly, that 30% is the secret sauce of this whole shebang. Giving yourself full permission to enjoy a third of your money absolutely guilt-free, that's what prevents budgeting burnout and keeps you going long-term.
But we have to live in reality. If rent alone completely breaks your 50% needs category, you aren't failing at math. You're just living in a really expensive housing market. Please don't treat this rule like rigid handcuffs that lock you in and make you feel like a failure. Instead, use it as a flexible measuring tape to help guide your choices. It's a diagnostic tool, not some punishing law.
Now, if dealing with exact percentages just stresses your brain out, let's simplify it even further into 4 basic buckets. Bucket 1, needs. You pay these first. Bucket 2, wants, which, again, are totally guilt-free. Bucket 3 is future you, which you just set up to automate. And bucket 4 is a really crucial buffer bucket. This buffer is basically your financial shock absorber. It just sits there waiting to absorb life's regular messy costs, like a forgotten annual subscription or a flat tire, so you don't have to desperately reach for a credit card.
Next up, you'll want to map those buckets onto a calendar using what's called the Cash Week Map. This framework guarantees that your payday and your actual bill due dates are finally living in the same reality. By tracking your income timing and identifying your bill cluster days, you completely prevent the dreaded Tuesday surprise. We all know that awful feeling of logging into your bank account on a random Tuesday only to find some massive auto draft wiped out your balance. Mapping it out ahead of time takes away all those jump scares.
And finally, Section 6, the reset loop. Because overwhelm is exactly how budgets die. We have to build in a routine that enthusiastically embraces the fact that we're imperfect humans. We need to completely replace that negative shame spiral we talked about with a positive reset loop. You just have to recognize that when a week goes totally sideways and you overspend, it's just information. It is just data, not a verdict on your personality. You simply gather that data without judging yourself and you try again next week.
To keep that momentum going and keep the barrier to entry super low, you can split your management into 2 really simple tasks. First is a weekly light check. This should literally take you 5 minutes while you're drinking your morning coffee. Just glance at your flexible spending and move any leftover money into your buffer. Then you do a monthly deep reset, maybe an hour, once a month, where you update your take-home income, refund those buckets, and adjust your course. It creates this really gentle, manageable rhythm of self-correction.
By rounding out those harsh financial edges, softening your self-judgment, and treating your money like a gentle, weekly experiment, you take your power back. So here's my question for you. Are you going to let your past financial mistakes dictate your identity? Or are you finally ready to trade the shame for a reset? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this gives you the practical tools you need to finally find some lasting peace with your finances.